direct questions. I don't know that they're tough questions per se. I think there are a lot of tough issues that our country is facing.
Does this mandate make sense?
That's the role of Face the Nation, to focus on the issues at hand. That means a civil, contextualized conversation with perspective.
CBS News. Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan, Sunday on CBS.
Our commitment to Ukraine will not weaken. We will stand for liberty and freedom today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes.
The idea that I'm biased against conservatives seems somewhat insane to me, given my own personal background.
I dearly hope and pray that he will run for re-election to the Senate.
The fact is, 2/3 of Americans don't want to see this rematch between Trump versus Biden. And 2/3 of Americans are feeling disaffected and not represented.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. A lot going on, and welcome to America Decides. President Biden said that allies would not waver in their defense of Ukraine during a speech at the NATO summit today. Nations in the alliance pledged more support for the country during a meeting with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy. President Biden says he looks forward to the day Ukraine becomes a NATO member. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, FBI Director Chris Wray testified before the House Judiciary Committee. He responded to criticism from Republican lawmakers. Let's bring in CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang, who joins us from Finland. Weijia, thank you for being here. What's your summary assessment of President Biden's visit to the NATO summit?
Robert, it's great to see you. I think President Biden is ending the summit exactly how he began, which is stressing that this alliance is stronger than ever, despite some bumps that we saw leading up to this meeting. As he left, he said, "We are together, we are together," when asked if he had a message for Vladimir Putin, because in the course of this summit, the G7, which is a different group, sort of had a sidebar meeting to declare a brand new securities agreement for Ukraine to bolster their efforts even more in the war against Russia. And Moscow was very quick to reply and say that it could be potentially dangerous and there may be consequences in the medium, long, and even short-term future. And so President Biden responded to that, and it was a very simple message, but that's what he said before he took off and came here to Finland to remind the powers that be that he is actually leading the charge and continues to do so, which really has been his message, Robert, since day one.
Speaking of that charge, let's listen to what President Biden had to say earlier today.
I hope we finally have put to bed the notion about whether or not Ukraine is welcome in NATO. It's going to happen. You're all moving in the right direction. I think it's just a matter of getting by the next few months.
Weijia, the president said he put to bed the idea that Ukraine's not welcome in NATO, but there were some tensions evident during this summit. Where does that all go from here?
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy issued a scathing statement in response to the fact that NATO did not have a firm timeline for when Ukraine might be able to join as a member of this alliance. And so President Biden, in that case that we just heard, said that he thought it would only be a matter of time. It's a question of when and not if, which is something that other NATO members agree with. But there was tension about how quickly Ukraine should be able to join. I will say that after the president made those remarks, he clarified and said that he didn't believe it would happen until the war ended. He has expressed this concern before because an attack against one is an attack against all, and he worried that all of the members would be dragged into a conflict with Russia. He also said that he believes that that Zelenskyy understood, and it seemed like he may have massaged the message a little bit, because he said as long as there are security commitments, Zelenskyy understands that the timing of when Ukraine joins does not matter, because he will have protections, he will have a long-term plan to continue this fight against Moscow. And the president believes that that's enough to assuage Zelenskyy, who, again, earlier this week was fired up about it. But they did leave on good terms with Zelenskyy, thanking the president for all the aid that he has supplied.
Weijia Jiang, thank you, and safe travels as you head home eventually. We appreciate it. Republican lawmakers grilled FBI Director Chris Wray during a hearing on Capitol Hill today. He defended the Bureau amid Republican criticism. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins us. Scott, why did the committee call in the FBI director?
This is an annual oversight investigation. It's tradition. It's practice that's common here in Congress. But thankfully, Bob, there was a water break and an intermission, because this was a marathon and an exhausting hearing. And having sat through most of it, this was as much a political proxy war as it was an actual hearing on the issues involving the FBI. There wasn't much discussion of the FBI's handling of its main issues: stopping gun violence, immigration issues, drug cases, firearms, child exploitation. This was a hearing with Christopher Wray in which Republicans were hitting him one after another on issues of politics, accusing the FBI and the Department of Justice of having a double standard, of going harder after former President Trump and his allies and conservatives than they do everybody else. Listen to this exchange between a committee Republican and Chris Wray as the hearing began.
4 out of 5 Americans said they believe there's a two-tiered system of justice in America today. They said that because there is.
The work the men and women of the FBI do to protect the American people goes way beyond the 1 or 2 investigations that seem to capture all the headlines.
Democrats spent a lot of their time at the dais accusing Republicans of engaging in conspiracy theories, throwing out double standards, and themselves politicizing the Department of Justice through their questioning. For 6 hours, Chris Wray answered questions without many big revelations we didn't expect when the day began.
Any real news here, or just a back and forth?
I think it's a better indicator of where things are and where things are going than the grains of testimony Chris Wray gave. This is where we are 6 months before the first caucus, 16 months before the election itself, Bob, where everything in Congress, including a hearing over law enforcement and the nation's safety, devolved into talk about Hunter Biden and President Biden, Donald Trump, John Durham. This became a political proxy war, more than an investigation and real detailed oversight over the FBI, a major law enforcement presence in America, handling real Main Street issues and Main Street cases. There's a lot more talk about Mar-a-Lago, records seized in that prosecution in Miami.
Turning to Alabama Senator, the Republican Tommy Tuberville, what's the latest with him as he faces backlash and criticism even from some Republicans over his comments about white nationalism?
For another day, Bob, in a U.S. Senate where 100 people believe they deserve a lot of attention, Tommy Tuberville is just standing beneath the brightest of spotlights all by himself. He is gaining so much of it. He's again trying to explain his prior comments that not all white nationalists are racist, saying his understanding now is that, yes, they are. And also trying to defend that bigger picture issue with the Pentagon, where he is still putting a slow pace, even a hold, on the promotions and announcements and appointments of senior military officials. He sat down with our David Martin tonight. Take a listen to some of this exchange.
Aren't you using these officers as political hostages in this never-ending debate about abortion?
This is a two-way street, okay? Again, if there was a problem that for readiness, if there was a problem for these admirals and generals, and they were really concerned about it, don't you think they'd sit down with me and say, let's work this out before we get out of this room? This is serious. It's obvious not serious because I've heard from nobody about this.
Late in the day, Virginia Democrat Tim Kaine was on the Senate floor absolutely unequivocally criticizing this hold from Tommy Tuberville, saying it really does impact military families, people who are counting on pay raises and relocations, impacting the spouses and the kids too. But Bob, there's a real sense here in Tommy Tuberville that he has amplified this argument. The reason he's got these holds in the first place, he disagrees with the Pentagon policy to pay for time off and travel for service members seeking abortion services. He really has raised the issue in a way that nobody else had. So for Tommy Tuberville, this is a protest without an end game, without an off-ramp, but one that will continue through the week.
Well, we'll see if any of those military leaders start to give him a phone call after seeing David Martin's interview. Scott McFarland, thank you so much for being with us. And as President Biden and G7 leaders pledge to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia, we will ask Foreign Relations Committee member and close President Biden ally, Senator Chris Coons, for his takeaways from the NATO summit. You are streaming America Decides.
If it's important to our nation,
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
it's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education. Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
on CBS News Streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship with each other.
And it becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag Oscar So White was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, oh, we're going to tell you about that, too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme,
the threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
Let's bring in our partners at the Weather Channel.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
Feel the forecast, streaming on CBS News.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Not one more child!
School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was going to fight. It's going to keep on happening.
And teachers taking lessons in how to fight back.
This is an exercise.
We approach it as it's you or them.
It shouldn't have to be your teacher's job to protect your life.
But will the battle over gun control,
People are afraid that they're going to lose their gun rights altogether.
be the hardest lesson of all?
The exercise, you're having to shoot at an adult. Are you prepared to have to kill one of your students?
Guns in the Classroom, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's the most successful alpine skier, male or female, ever, and a worldwide inspiration.
We need a lot of women doing sports really, really well.
The story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
Our commitment to Ukraine will not weaken. We will stand for liberty and freedom today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes.
Welcome back to America Decides. President Biden, he sure hasn't been shy about his commitment to Ukraine in its war with Russia. Joining us now is Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator, thanks for being here.
Great to be on with you, Bob. Thanks for the chance.
Senator, you're a confidant of President Biden, a longtime leader on foreign policy in the United States Senate. What's your latest assessment of where Ukraine stands in terms of joining NATO?
Well, Ukraine is stronger today than it was before the Vilnius summit. President Zelenskyy came and got commitments to closer consultation, to continued robust military and economic support, and to a future pathway. He did not get the explicit timeline for an invitation to join NATO that he was seeking, but both in his bilateral meeting with our president and in his meeting with the other heads of state of the 31 current NATO members, I am confident that President Zelenskyy left encouraged and strengthened as Ukraine continues its counteroffensive to push out the Russian occupiers of eastern and southern Ukraine.
How much assurance did he get from President Biden?
Well, I wasn't in the conversation, Bob, but I am confident that he got strong assurances of continued financial and military support. As you know, Ukraine's in the middle of a war, which means that there was no chance that we would admit Ukraine to NATO right now. But the pathway towards NATO membership requires Ukraine to make a number of important reforms and improvements to their rule of law, their media, their electoral process, and their economy for admission to the EU, which is a critical first step. They also need to upgrade their military, their equipment, their platforms, their training, which is underway as a part of NATO, providing members of NATO providing critical resources and military platforms. So I think President Zelenskyy can see a clear path towards future NATO membership on the far side of this war. But frankly, he needs to first win this war, and we need to continue providing the critical military and economic support that will make that possible.
And what's your view of how long this war could last?
It could last a long time, but frankly, it will be shorter the more we continue to provide the training, the equipment, and the support that those who are fighting and dying bravely on the front lines in Ukraine deserve. I was recently in Europe on a bipartisan delegation trip. We met with leaders of both the EU and NATO, and I was struck, Bob, that the numbers are roughly this, that other than the United States, all the other members of NATO have delivered about $72 billion in support for Ukraine. The United States has so far delivered about $77 billion, very close. There are 47 countries, NATO allies and other partners around the world supporting Ukraine in its fight. The United States needs to stay the course. Our partners and allies need to stay the course. And the more we deliver and the faster we get it to the front lines, the more likely it is that this war will end sooner.
Senator, as you know, this is not just playing out in Europe as a discussion. It's also playing out as the 2024 presidential campaign unfolds. Former President Trump and other Republicans seem to have some reservations about President Biden's policy on Ukraine. Do you believe Democrats will be able to make a convincing case to the American people in the next year about sustaining this policy on Ukraine?
I do, and it enjoys bipartisan support here in the Senate. Frankly, I am grateful that today, as the heads of state from all across Europe and North America, all of the NATO allies are gathering in Vilnius, that our president is someone who is a seasoned leader on the world stage with decades of experience. The former president called Vladimir Putin a genius and was more interested in currying favor with Vladimir Putin than he was with being close or closer to our NATO allies. The contrast between the chaos that former President Trump caused in our alliances and our relationships and the ways in which President Biden, particularly in his successful leadership around the war in Ukraine, has pulled NATO closer together, has helped support the expansion of NATO, and has strengthened NATO, and thus delivered a strategic defeat to Vladimir Putin. That contrast could not be sharper. And I believe the average American still believes in freedom and still believes it's important that the United States stand shoulder to shoulder with the allies who have helped make us more secure and more prosperous over the nearly 75 years of the NATO alliance.
So many presidents, Senator, as you know, when they run for a second term, they talk about their efforts on foreign policy, but domestic policy so often dominates presidential campaigns. There's a new CPI report out today saying inflation is cooling across the United States, but there are polls that show the president's approval numbers sagging in many parts of this country. Will the president, this White House, your party, be able to convince voters that their program on the economy is actually breaking through on these issues like inflation?
Yes, Bob, because the reality on the ground is steadily getting better. First, as for polling, I'll remind you that in the run-up to the midterms in 2022, President Biden's approval rating was roughly where it is now, and yet he had the most successful first midterm of any president in 9 decades. Second, He was just at a groundbreaking in South Carolina for a new state-of-the-art advanced manufacturing plant. There are new manufacturing plants, new infrastructure projects coming online all over this country, in Pennsylvania and Arizona, in Georgia and Texas, in South Carolina and Illinois, because of bipartisan legislation like the infrastructure law or legislation that only Democrats supported, like the Inflation Reduction Act, that are pouring investments into communities all over our country. Joe Biden's view on economics is fundamentally different from former President Trump's or most Republicans. Instead of supporting tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans or the most profitable companies and hoping that somehow that trickles down, where instead over decades mostly they've shipped jobs overseas, President Biden's approach is to invest in America and rebuild our country from the middle out.
You mentioned President Biden going to South Carolina. One of your colleagues, Senator Joe Manchin, is going to another early voting state next week to have an event with no labels. Most Democrats seem to be united behind President Biden. Do you think it's a good or bad move for Senator Manchin to be going to New Hampshire and having this event with no labels?
Look, Senator Manchin and I were sworn in on the same day. We've served alongside each other for 13 years, and we're friends. And I understand that Senator Manchin is exploring his options, whether to run for re-election to the Senate in West Virginia, consider retirement, or consider this other path. I dearly hope and pray that he will run for re-election to the Senate. He is a very talented West Virginia politician, probably the only Democrat who could hold that seat in the Senate. And when he has teamed up with the president and they have delivered legislative results for West Virginia and the American people, it's been very positive. He will not ultimately be successful if he runs for president, although there are millions of Americans who would like an independent candidate or a third-party candidate. They are very, very far from a majority. And in the end, I hope he chooses the path where he will most be successful, which is re-election to his seat here in the United States Senate.
Senator Chris Coons, thank you for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob.
No labels might not have a presidential candidate yet, but what they are doing with their common sense, what they're calling their common sense tour, could be coming to a swing state near you sometime soon. The group's national director joins us soon to talk about their upcoming event in New Hampshire and their plans for 2024. You're streaming America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports. Controversial Congressman George Santos.
Why won't you answer our questions?
How did he manage to get elected?
Thank you very much, and God bless you, and God bless the USA.
George Santos' campaign was a campaign of deceit, lies, fabrication.
And who is he, really?
I knew him as Anthony DeVolder from Queens.
Really, who he is, he's a fraud.
I compare him to the Tinder swindler.
From people who know him, the truth, the facts, the lies.
He would say that he was worth $100 million.
It's an incredibly cynical episode in American politics, beyond satire.
Had you ever seen anything like this?
No, and I hope I never see it again.
Campaign of Deceit, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She dazzled on the court and off the court as a businesswoman. Thank you for joining us on Person to Person. Tennis superstar and entrepreneur Serena Williams.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
I asked my students, what are we going to do about racism in the United States?
The backlash over teaching about racism in American schools.
I don't think it has any place in the classroom.
We can either pretend and say, no, we're not racist and we're all great people, or we can actually start to do the really, really hard work of addressing it.
How did you lose your job? I made the statement that white privilege is a fact.
Is it helping diversity and inclusion?
When you bring in different people's stories and experience, it enriches education.
If you don't talk about something, it doesn't go away.
Or driving us further apart?
What schools are doing to our children in the name of anti-racism is in fact teaching them racism.
The intention is to put us in this war against each other.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
I was entitled to equal pay for equal work under the law.
Does the Supreme Court's power need to be checked?
9 Supreme Court justices, 5 of them said no, she's not entitled. That's not right.
calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment.
Republican-appointed justices have all tended to go in one direction, with the Democratic-appointed justices tending to go in another.
Even though it's only 9 justices, it takes 5 of them to make the law of the land.
Does it have political impact? True. Political intent? Probably not true.
If the American people don't trust the judgments of their court, that's a real problem for our democracy.
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now.
On our places, bright shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my 2 good friends, and we talk about the world.
Welcome back to America Decides. No Labels is ramping up its efforts to get on the ballot in all 50 states for the 2024 election, but the group doesn't have a candidate. They are pushing for a potential ticket that could serve as an alternative to a hypothetical Biden-Trump rematch. And joining us now is former Democratic Congressman from South Carolina, Joe Cunningham, who's now the National Director for No Labels. No Labels will be in Manchester, New Hampshire next Monday to talk to voters. What exactly do you want to say to voters in New Hampshire as an organization?
Well, we're excited about being up there on Monday, and we're going to be unveiling Common Sense, which is a book of 30 different policy ideas. And the purpose of this is just to ignite a conversation about various issues that our national leaders are struggling with right now. And we're bringing up 2 of our original co-chairs, Senator Joe Manchin and Governor Jim Huntsman, to talk about this and attempt to bring people together and tone down the divisive rhetoric and talk about solutions, which is, I think, what Americans crave right now.
Senator Manchin, he's mentioned as a possible presidential candidate. Former Ambassador John Huntsman is a former Republican presidential candidate. Is this the making of a possible ticket?
Well, look, I think any names right now being floated are just mere speculation. We haven't even gotten to that point. And we have made a decision that we're not going to decide to nominate a ticket until after Super Tuesday, which occurs in March. Our convention will be in Dallas in April. The purpose of this is just to start a conversation. And we're going to be having many leaders throughout this tour of Common Sense coming on and talking about different ideas. So this is just to kickstart this event.
Well, how are you so convinced this is where the vast majority of Americans are?
Because we spend our hours and days talking to people and polling, using data, using modeling. And what we found out that, you know, oftentimes 90% of the conversation is done by the loudest voices. And again, like, we have a growing majority or growing number of independents in this country because they feel disaffected with the partisanship. And what Common Sense does is gives people a place to land, gives people a place to stand on these certain issues.
Now, you're you're former Democratic congressman. You know, many Democrats say, hey, President Biden, he is, in their view, the common sense Democratic candidate, and they see your effort as somehow a distraction, a potential spoiler.
Well, we reject the view of spoiler because our data shows it pulls evenly from both parties. And what do you say to 2/3 of Americans who don't want to see this rematch, who don't want to be served cold leftovers, who want something new and want, you know, an idea that represents their own? And so this is just essentially giving people a place to stand. And that's what Common Sense is, the first step in that process. And again, we can reassess in March and April whether or not a ticket needs to be nominated. We've been very clear about this, about the hurdles that need to be overcome. Number one, the 2 major nominees have to be viewed so unfavorable that a 3rd candidate is warranted. And number 2, there must be a clear path to victory for such a ticket. And we don't plan on nominating a ticket unless those 2 hurdles are cleared. But right now, in July 2023, this Common Sense will serve as kind of a message to elected officials, and we welcome anybody.
It seems like more like a warning.
Not really.
Well, that if you don't kind of move in this direction, you could face a no labels ticket.
What we're doing is holding up a mirror to the American public and saying, this is where Americans stand on these particular issues. You know, everything from crime and immigration to, women's reproductive health, gun safety, all these different issues that seem so polarizing, but there's actually a lot of Americans who agree on a lot of it. And so what we're doing is we're showing these elected officials and these politicians that this is where the majority of Americans stand. And if you're not willing to stand there, we will occupy that space then.
Senator Manchin, We just spoke with Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. He believes Senator Manchin could be exploring a presidential bid. How serious do you think he's exploring it as a no-labels executive?
I haven't spoken to him about it. Not sure. And again, we haven't any names or floating names is speculation at this point because we're not even sure we're going to nominate a ticket yet.
Right.
You know.
If President Biden decides not to run, what does no labels do?
Well, going back to those 2 points, you know, figuring out where those two major nominees are, if they're viewed so unfavorable, and who steps in for Joe Biden. That's something to be considered.
Or if Trump, former President Trump, same thing.
Yeah, same answer. I mean, we've been very, very clear. And look, there are groups pushing back on this, which I view as anti-democratic.
Well, many people are pushing back on it because they think, especially on the Democratic side, inside where you served in Congress as a Democrat, that the Democratic view, I don't need to repeat it, you've heard it ad nauseum, is that by doing this, you're going to elevate Trump.
This is the United States of America, and we should be fighting for voting rights and ballot access. And that's all we're trying to do. We're trying to get on the ballot in 50 states and Washington, D.C. to give people a choice. Americans deserve a choice, and there's nothing written in the Constitution about political parties.
How many states are you on the ballot on right now?
We're on the ballot in about almost half a dozen states right now. 5 states.
And do you have a timeline for how many more states you want to get by, let's say, the end of the year?
Yeah, we're hoping to try to get on nearly half of them by the end of the year.
Okay. Former Democratic Congressman Joe Cunningham, now the National Director of No Labels, a group that's causing a stir here in Washington and around the country. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
That does it for today. You can stream America Decides Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.
It's a history-making meeting. 4 extraordinary women who are all 4-star